Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant, a work in ethics, first published in 1785. The principal ideas of which are: nothing is unconditionally good except the good will. The good will, which is a rational will, acts not merely in accordance with duty, but from duty. The good will wills as obedient to the moral law. Duty consists in observing the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. A second form of the categorical imperative is: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. A third form of the categorical imperative is: act always as if you were legislating for a universal realm of ends. Ethics, like physics, so Immanuel Kant holds in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, Grundlagen der Metaphysik der Sitten, is partly empirical and partly a priori. This work deals only with the a priori part, in that it is based entirely on the use of reason without recourse to experience. Everyone must recognize, Kant writes, that since moral law imply absolute necessity, they cannot be merely empirical. For example, "Thou shalt not lie" applies not merely to all human beings, but to all rational beings. Its ground, therefore, must be found in pure reason. Moreover, what is done morally must be not only in accordance with law, but also done for the sake of law. If this were not its motivation, different circumstances of the agent would call forth different responses. This book, issued as a preliminary to an intended metaphysic of morals, the Critic of Practical Reason of 1788, comprises a critical examination of purely practical reason and establishes the supreme principle of morality. The order of inquiry is from common moral knowledge to the supreme principle, analysis, then back to application in practice, synthesis. Kant begins by claiming that nothing in the world, indeed nothing even beyond the world, can possibly be conceived which could be called good without qualification except a good will. Not intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, or the gifts of fortune. Possession of them is a positive evil, if not combined with goodwill, which indeed is the indispensable condition even of worthiness to be happy. And although moderation, self-control, and calm deliberation are all conducive to goodwill, they can also characterize the cruel villain and make him even more abominable. The goodness of the goodwill does not depend on its accomplishments. It would sparkle like a jewel in its own right, as something that had its full worth in itself, even if external circumstances entirely frustrated its actions. The good will is the rational will. Why has nature appointed reason to rule the will? Not for the sake of adaptation, which would be more effectively accomplished by instinct. Moreover, when a cultivated reason makes enjoyment its end, true contentment rarely ensues. Reason then is intended for something more worthy than production of happiness. Being a practical faculty, yet not suitable for producing a will, good merely as a means, instinct would do better, reason must be given us to produce a will good in itself. Everyone knows, at least implicitly, according to Kant, the concept of a will good in itself. We need only bring to light that to which we give first place in our moral estimate of action. Kant considers the concept of duty, distinguishing between what is done in accordance with duty, but motivated perhaps by a natural inclination or a selfish purpose, and what is done from duty. Moral import is clearly seen only in those cases where, on account of absence of inclination, duty is exhibited as the motive. It is our duty to be kind and amiable. People are naturally inclined to kindness, but do they act from duty or inclination? Ordinarily we cannot be sure which. However, suppose that someone in such deep sorrow as to be insensible to the feelings of others, yet tears himself out of this condition to perform a kind action. We see then that his action has genuine moral worth, or we know a man who by nature is unsympathetic, yet behaves beneficently. He must be acting from duty, not inclination. Moral worth attaches to action from duty, even with respect to the pursuit of happiness. According to Kant, everyone has an inclination to be happy, and particular inclinations toward what are regarded as the particular constituents of happiness. Still, all these subtracted, the duty to pursue one's happiness would remain, and only the dutiful pursuit would have true moral worth. Pursuit of happiness is a duty because unhappiness could tempt to the neglect of other duties. The commandment to love our neighbour and our enemies should be read as requiring us to exercise beneficence from duty. Love cannot be commanded. A central idea in Kant's work is that the moral worth of action performed from duty lies not in its purpose, but in the maxim, or rule or principle, by which it is determined. Otherwise, moral worth would depend on inclinations and incentives, which cannot be the case. Duty is the necessity of an action executed from respect for law, writes Kant. I cannot have respect for the mere consequence of or inclination, but only for what can overpower all inclination. This can be no other than law itself. To be an object of respect is the same as to be valid as a source of command. The law determines the will objectively. Subjectively, I am determined to respect for the law. This subjective element is the maxim of my action, that I ought to follow the law whatever my inclination may be. Respect, the conception of a worth that overrides self-love, can be present only in a rational being. The only kind of law, the conception of which is capable of determining the will without reference to consequences, must be the notion of conformity to law as such. That is to say, never act in such a way that you could not also will that your maxim should be a universal law requiring everybody in these circumstances to do this action. This is what the common reason of mankind has constantly in view in moral matters, according to Kant. For example, may I extricate myself from a difficulty by making a false promise? A prudential calculation of consequences might or might not recommend this course, but to determine whether it is consistent with duty, I need only ask whether I could wish that everyone in difficulty might extricate himself similarly. I see that the maxim would destroy itself, for if it were a universal law, no one could derive any help from lying, since no promise made in a difficult situation would be believed. So there is no difficulty in deciding whether a proposed course of action would be morally good. I need only ask myself whether my maxim could become a universal law. If not, it must be rejected and the action foregone. Reason compels respect for universal legislation. Every other motive must defer to duty. Common reason habitually employs this test. What if everybody did that? It is the advantage of practical over theoretical reason to be everybody's possession. Ordinary people are as likely to hit the mark as philosophers, indeed, more so, being less liable to be led astray by subtle fallacies. Nevertheless, philosophy is called upon to buttress reason against the assaults of inclination and against specious arguments on their behalf. That is why a metaphysics of morals is required. Although only what is done from duty has moral worth, it is not possible to be certain in even one instance that an action was in fact done from duty. Some philosophers have indeed attributed all motivation to self-interest. They may be right as a matter of psychology, for how can we be sure that what we most sincerely and carefully conclude to be action from duty was not in reality prompted by some hidden impulse of inclination? Duty, therefore, is not an empirical concept, according to Kant. Moreover, its universality and necessity also show its non-empirical nature, nor could it be derived from examples. How would we know in the first place that the cases were fit to serve as examples if we did not presuppose knowledge of the concept? Even if we consider the action of God himself, we must antecedently possess the concept of duty in order to judge them as moral. Duty, therefore, is a concept a priori. While this fact is obvious, it nevertheless needs to be explicitly argued, for on account of the popularity of empirical rules recommended as bases of morality. It is a mistake to try and popularize morality by holding out the inducement of happiness. On the contrary, the picture of disinterested duty has the strongest appeal even to children, because here reason recognizes that it can be practical. Kant argues that if reason, which tells us what principles of actions are objectively required, infallibly determined the will, we would always choose the good. But in fact the will is affected also by subjective incentives that clash with the dictates of reason. Thus the will, when not completely good, as it never is in human beings, experiences the pull of reason as constraint. The command of reason, the objective principle constraining the will, is also called an imperative. A perfectly good or holy will, being always determined to action only by objective laws, would not experience constraint. According to Kant, imperatives are either hypothetical, commanding something to be done in order to achieve a desired end. If you want X, do A, or categorical, commanding an action as objectively necessary. Do A, never mind what you desire. Hypothetical imperatives are further subdivided into rules of skill, which tell what to do in order to achieve some end, which one may or may not wish to achieve. Heal a person or poison him, and counsels of prudence, telling him what to do to achieve happiness. The one end that all rational beings in fact do have. But the counsels of prudence are still hypothetical, depending on what the agent counts as part of his happiness. Only the categorical imperative is the imperative of morality. How are imperatives possible? How can reason constrain the will? I shall take up that question in part 2.